Well, welcome everyone to the first program in the Kentwood series of programs that the Ozarks Studies Institute is executing this year. We were planning to start last month, but then illness intervened, and so this is the first one, so no pressure. Susan Croce Kelly is our speaker tonight, and she's amazing. She's written 2 books about Route 66. You've been an editor, you've been a newspaper woman, you've been a owner of a magazine and publisher of a magazine. She's currently editor of OzarksWatch magazine, does a great job at that, and the next issue is coming out real soon. One person in this room, we were waiting on an article, I will not name names, but they got it in. I'm the last one now. I've got to get the book review in. Actually, Kitty's book. I've got to get the book review finished, so this weekend. So tonight she's going to be talking about her kinswoman and the life of Lucile Morris Upton. Again, I was an amazing person. I've heard very good things and read good things about her book about the ball robbers. Still, it's considered a kind of a classic treatment of the ball robbers. And, so anyway, I'll turn it over to Susan to tell us all about her life and maybe Betty Love too. Who knows?
Betty Love too.
All right, thanks.
Thank you, Tom. Well, I think I was right. I said that doing this talk tonight was going to be a little daunting because I figured everybody in the room, almost everybody, either knew Lucile or had listened to me talk for hours about Lucile or had heard me speak already. So I was trying to figure out what I could do that would be a little bit different. And I got to thinking about my relationship with Lucile. And I really got to know her when I was in my 20s. I knew her as a kid, but she was pretty kind of scary for a little kid. And when I was in my 20s and working in the News-Leader, she was in her 80s and still doing her Sunday newspaper column, The Good Old Days, about Springfield history. And she was an institution. And during those years, I spent as much time as I could with her and listening to her stories of the good old days. And I was fascinated with a career that had almost spanned the continent, almost spanned a century, and moved under its own steam. During those years, like I said, I spent as much time as I could with her. And being a young reporter and her being a legend, I was just in awe. Years later, after Lucile's death, of course, in 1992, I decided I should write a book about her someday. And I was living in Chicago, but in 1995 I came back to Springfield and interviewed as many people as I could think of who had known her. Michael Bryan for one, Dale Freeman, and Ann Dodson from the newspaper, and then friends like attorney John Halston, who was a civic leader and a fellow history buff, and Gordon McCann. And then it took until Joel and I moved back to the Ozarks 20 years ago for me to pick up the thread and move forward. I re-interviewed a lot of those people, this time about Betty and Lucile, and a few more people, did some research, and worked on the book. And what became Newspaper Woman of the Ozarks was going to be a straightforward biography of Lucile. She was a school teacher, a newspaper reporter, and an author. And after she retired, she was elected to city council in Springfield. And that's when she really became an activist for Ozark historic preservation. Then my book segued into the story of the changing Ozarks during the 20th century. And finally, it morphed into the tale of 20th century newspapering and 20th century newspaper women. One friend of mine called the book Many Layered. Well, one of the layers, and perhaps the most important, wasn't even clear to me until I got an email from Meredith Sisko just before the book came out. There. Meredith wrote, Lucile and Betty, Betty of course being Betty Love, were my heroes growing up in the Ozarks. My plans, said Meredith, centered on escaping the life of domesticity that my aunt said awaited me, and getting out into the wide world to pursue my dreams, just like those fearless female journalists. So lately, I've been thinking about why Lucile and Betty were so important to Meredith and to other people. Obviously, they both believed in themselves. They believed in what they were doing, and they had a really good time doing it. Which meant, whether it meant wading through rivers, confronting bank robberies, risking car accidents, or getting where they were going, or even being first on the scene of a murder. But there had to be more than just good stories, although there were a lot of those. Ultimately, I came up with this list of lessons or rules of the road that seemed to me to have been guiding principles for Lucile, and a pretty good set of marching orders for the rest of us. There were 7. I came up with 7. Listen is 1. You never know where that will lead. And if you remember Bob Linder's presentation about his career in newspaper photography, he talked about walking into a house with an assignment and not rarely coming out with what he thought he was going to get when he came in. So pay attention, listen. Excuse me, trust yourself. Set your own standards and live up to them. Don't let powerful people get in your way. And if they do, don't take it to heart. Don't take yourself so seriously that you will miss the adventure. Always say thank you and always write back to people. And maybe most important, don't let the facts get in the way of a good story. And some newspaper people in this room had issues with that. But I'll tell you about that later. Now I'm going to tell you how those things played out in her life. Lucile grew up listening to family stories. This picture that's her mother and her 2 brothers, I'm guessing when she was about 9 years old. Since she was born only 30 years after the Civil War, she heard of an uncle who was killed during the Battle of Wilson's Creek. She heard of another uncle who had joined the Confederacy and moved to Texas so that he wouldn't have to fight anybody that he knew. She heard of the guerrilla gang that burned Dadeville to the ground, leaving only 1 building. And later, the gang had been somebody that grew up in Dadeville, so you can draw your own conclusions about that. And then she heard about this estate of Daniel Boone's son Nathan that was moldering away down the road in Ash Grove. And she also knew about her grandmother's magical amulet, the Mad Stone, that was used to cure rabies in people who were bitten by mad dogs. Listening, of course, is the lifeblood of being a good reporter. But listening and then doing something about what you hear is something else again. And Lucile did that. She always credited those stories for her lifelong interest in history and her later activism to successfully preserve Wilson's Creek Battlefield as part of the National Park Service and the Nathan Boone home in Ash Grove as a state historic site. And this picture over here on the far right, Lucile is with a bunch of people, and Dr. Ellie Metter from Drury at Wilson's Creek. He's pointing out historic places as they were so we're working with the National Park Service over the years to try to get recognition for Wilson's Creek. Her father died when she was only 9, and her mother never remarried. So she knew that she was going to have to take care of herself in her life. And to her, that meant she would become a school teacher. She said, I didn't know anything else. And she did. When she was 19, she got her first job as a teacher in her hometown of Dadeville. And there she fell in love with another teacher. His name was Homer Garland. He was from up around Warrensburg. And his goal in life was to save his money, go west, and become a newspaper reporter. They talked together for a year. Then Garland left for World War I. After the war, he did become a reporter for the Tulsa Democrat. He came to visit Lucile, and he also wrote her many passionate letters about his love for her, about being a reporter and how much he loved that, and about the importance of newspapers in the world. Now, these letters are all being digitized at the library. All of her papers. I amassed a bunch of papers from the family over the years, and I gave them all to the Library Center. And even the love letters from Homer are part of the collection. If you want to read them, they're fun. He's a newspaper reporter. He's a good writer. So, but one of his letters, some of his letters were in awe of being a newspaper man, and some of them were a little more cynical. And here's one of them. We're having it very dull insofar as big local news is concerned in Tulsa. A few deaths, conventions, minor accidents, and that sort of thing. But one of these days are nice. There'll be a suicide and a train wreck and a killing all at once. Then business will pick up. Clearly, reporters had their finger on the pulse of the city. Odds are it was Garland in those letters that lit the fire in Lucile for her own career. But those letters weren't enough to keep Lucile and Garland together. By 1922, they had parted ways, and Lucile was looking for something to do, an adventure. She found a job in Roswell, New Mexico, of all places, and she rode what was known as the teacher train out west. I guess a lot of places out west needed, qualified teachers. And every time I say that, I get this picture of a stagecoach in a Western movie, and the school marm gets out, and then she comes in and she gets the town all sorted out. But while she was in Roswell, I don't think she sorted out the town, but she did teach school. And she also explored the Southwest, learned about Roswell's history, because that's what she always did, and had a connection to Missouri. And then she did a lot of thinking about her future. And while she was in Roswell, she made up her mind she was going to go home, save her money, and go to journalism school and become a newspaper reporter herself. So at the end of the spring term, she hitched a ride home from a friend who had an automobile. And on the way, they took a side trip to Denver. When they got to Denver, the friend was sightseeing, and Lucile, with her new convictions, found the office of the Denver Post and went in and applied for a job. They told her they didn't have an opening, but why didn't she try the Denver Express, a smaller paper across town? So she went to the Express, excuse me, and she asked if they had an opening, and she wanted a job, even though she hadn't been to journalism school and she didn't have any experience. And the editor said, "Good, I'd love to train my own people," and he hired her on the spot. So she went to the Express office, or she went to the Express. It was a long shot, but she had trusted her instincts. And as you know, it worked. That was 101 years ago. It was in the summer of 1923. And her main assignment at the Express was to be a sob sister and write an advice to the lovelorn column under the name of Cynthia Gray, which was hard work. She worked hard to learn how to answer young women's questions about everything from makeup to boyfriends to mother-in-laws to lost dogs, in fact. And in fact, also how to chart their futures. What do I do? Do I have a career? Do I quit my job when I get married? What do I do? As she became more sure of herself, Lucile's advice became more direct, essentially telling her readers that it was up to them what happened in their future, to figure out what they wanted and then trust themselves and go after it. And while she was working in Denver, she was also fortunately able to spend part of her time covering real stories as a reporter. And by a fluke, she had a chance to cover President Warren Harding's last visit west when he came through Denver, obviously Harding. Excuse me. And that remained a highlight of her career and her life for the rest of her life. I mean, getting to talk to the president. But in the long run, probably what was even more important than meeting the president was what happened when the National Women's Party came to Colorado in 1924 to push for passage of the Equal Rights Amendment, which still hasn't been passed 100 years later. When the city guest centered at that event, the party founder Alice Paul told Lucile she had to join the Women's Party before she could conduct an interview. So Lucile joined, covered the convention, and then quit the Women's Party. Later she said, "Actually, as a reporter, I have no business of any kind in any kind of a movement. I believe that is the business of a newspaper reporter, to give unbiased reports of happenings and not be involved in the mechanics of them." And that opinion never changed. Years later, when I talked to John Holston, he told me about working with Lucile to preserve the Wilson's Creek Civil War battlefield and the Nathan Boone home as important historic sites. She was always in on the meetings, said Holston, but she always refused to serve on committees. In other words, Lucile's presence guaranteed a newspaper article, but in her mind, being an actual part of one of the groups would cast suspicion of bias on her job as a reporter. She was thoroughly objective, Holston said. And even after she retired from the newspaper and was a member of city council, he said none of her friends would ever lobby her. They didn't dare. She had her standards. She also liked being a reporter more than being a sob sister. So after a year in Denver, she found a job as a full-time reporter at the El Paso Times. Then, through a colleague in El Paso, she got a job with the International News Service, INS, in London. So she quit her job in El Paso and came home to tell everybody goodbye. And when she got to the Ozarks, her mother was sick. She stayed around, and the longer she stayed around, like a lot of people, she said, "I just think I'll stay here and not go on." And that was the beginning of her time in the Ozarks. That was in 1926. And so since she was going to stay, first she applied to big city papers, the Kansas City Star and the Post-Dispatch. She had a wonderful letter of recommendation, which is also in the archives, from her old editor. But both newspapers turned her down because she was a woman, in spite of her experience. Now, from what I know of Lucile, I suspect that she was disappointed, but she may well have felt that it was more their loss than hers. In fact, when she was interviewing the people in the National Women's Party, one of the women was a financial backer of the Women's Party, a woman named Alva Belmont. There she is. And Lucile tried to interview her, and she said, I couldn't because she kept trying to interview me. She wanted to know if I faced discrimination in my work. I was so deliriously happy to have a newspaper job. I couldn't complain about anything. So in 1926, still deliriously happy with newspaper work, she joined the Springfield Leader, our town's oldest newspaper. And I don't know if you've seen it, but Brian Grubbs at the library has a copy of the very first issue of the Leader. It came out in 1867, I think. And he's very proud of it. Keeps it kind of in the back under lock and key, but if you ask him, he'll show it to you. At the Leader, among her other assignments, she was assigned to cover the courthouse, which included the courts, county government, the jail, and the sheriff's office. She delighted in being in on the action at the courthouse, and she thoroughly enjoyed being the only woman in a man's world. I never will forget the expression on the face of the sheriff and his deputies when I first walked into that office, she said later. It took them a considerable time to get used to a woman popping into the office every little while to find out what they were doing. But she kept coming, and eventually she was accepted and respected for the professional that she was. She took her job very seriously, and as I've said, even though she believed that her job was just to cover the story and not be part of it, she quickly learned to make exceptions when it made sense. In 1929 and again in 1932, she was not only the reporter, but also the heroine of two great aviation adventures. The first was the St. Louis to Springfield leg of the Ford Air Tour with pilot Wiley Post. The Air Tour was a promotion just for aviation, commercial aviation, and it was races from city to city to city across the country, involving, obviously, newspaper reporters who could tell people what happened. And her pilot for the St. Louis Springfield leg of the Ford Air Tour was pilot Wiley Post. And Post, obviously, soon to be world famous, she described him as pleasant and friendly as we chatted beside the plane before we took off. She wrote to her readers to say, I am thrilled to be riding in one of the racing planes, is putting it mildly. This is my first airplane ride. Well, most of her readers never even been close to an airplane. But not only was it her first ride, but her plane actually won that day's race and landed in Springfield in front of 20,000 cheering people. That's how big of a deal it was. Now, the second time, she was part of a promotion for passenger air travel. Transcontinental and Western Air asked her to fly space available from Springfield to New York and to write about the trip. On the way, she got bumped, and she had to spend the night in Cincinnati. Then she was delayed in Pittsburgh until 10 o'clock at night. And that night flight just amazed her. She wrote, never have I seen such a show. Below, miles and acres and swarms of lights. I gasped to realize that all this unreal, unbelievable scene, which I watched from the skies, actually existed. And if you're curious, that's the wife of another pilot in the Ford Air race and a promotion man from Ford. Not a pilot, unfortunately. But in both of those cases, she could have balked. She could have written dry articles about the nuts and bolts of the trip. But she had enough sense to know that she wanted to share her personal feelings about those adventures with her growing numbers of readers. Now, one of the reasons that Meredith grew up knowing about Lucile and Betty was because they both had spent years not just writing stories and taking photos, but becoming personally acquainted with the newspaper reading public, like her connection to the readers with the flying stories. Betty took people's pictures, which guaranteed that they would remember her. She also had a growing reputation as an outstanding photojournalist, and later was nationally known for color photography for newspapers. Lucile, for her part, was editor of 2 newspaper columns, each of which attracted many fans. The first one, The Good Old Days, which I mentioned earlier, came about after she quit the newspaper following her marriage to Eugene Upton, who was a court reporter in the Greene County courts. During World War II, the managing editor ask her to come back to work because so many men had left the staff. And Upton had 2 sons who were fighting in the Pacific, and Lucile said she just couldn't come back to work, but she might write a column. And the result was a weekly look back to the news of half a century before. And it proved so popular that it lasted 40 years, well into Lucile's 80s, and writing about events that she had covered herself as a young reporter. And I actually have copies, if you want, of the good old days from this week in 50 years ago, which she was writing about what was going on in Springfield 50 years before that, 100 years ago. And it mentions the death of Woodrow Wilson, the visit of John Philip Sousa to Springfield, and a shipment of 30,000 wild rabbits to a store in the on the East Coast somewhere. And it mentioned that the rabbits were worth $0.25 apiece to the trappers and hunters. So there must have been a big market for rabbits. Also, there was a blizzard that week. Hopefully we will not have ones. Lucile's other column, Over the Ozarks, was one that she inherited after she returned full-time to the newspaper after her husband died of a heart attack. Over the Ozarks was poetry, essays, and reminiscences from readers with a hefty dose of Ozark history. And the thing was, that was so special about those columns was not the columns themselves, but that Lucile became pen pals with not only her contributors, but also anyone else, whoever mailed her a letter. She always wrote back. Both Ann Dodson and Elizabeth McCain, a businesswoman friend of Betty's and Lucile's, took great pains to let me know that Lucile always answered all of her mail and wrote back to everyone. And these people became her friends over time. And then there was the woman who wrote her a personal letter, not for publication, that I found in Lucile's papers, to tell Lucile how the column had affected her. Thanks so much for using my little poems, the woman wrote. I'm 72 years old and I have lived nearly all kinds of life, from riches to rags, and now I'm on an old age pension. I'm a lonely Republican in Missouri. Times have changed. I'm a lonely Republican here in Missouri, and I resent having it thrown in my face. Roosevelt is all the reason that you have a pension. And after getting my name in print so many times with my poems, I am at last, and there anyhow, a person in my own right, and not just another old woman on relief. So don't forget to say thank you and write back. You never know how important it may be. And finally, for Mike O'Brien, don't let the facts get in the way of a good story. I'm pretty sure that this is one of the reasons that today, if I say Lucile Morris Upton, anybody I'm talking to will answer back, and Betty Love. Because in the years between 1950 and Lucile's retirement in 1964, Lucile and Betty were all over the Ozarks as a team, covering all kinds of stories and making a name for themselves as Meredith's fearless female journalists. Now, fearless, yes, but as far as Meredith was concerned, fearless had to do with their confidence in themselves, much more than actual danger. Now, they did cover their share of bank robberies, at least one murder, and many general city desk assignments that were kind of dicey. But over time, Lucile's lust for Ozarks history and Betty's growing reputation as a photographer meant that they did more and more Sunday layout pages, which were much more feature stories. And the 1950s and 60s were ripe for that kind of story. The country commemorated the centennial of the Civil War, and during those years, a lot of towns in this part of the world had their own centennials. They loved it when Betty came down and took pictures of their queens and their quilts and their beards, and Lucile came and wrote about that, and I wrote about the history. She always wrote about the histories of the towns. But the thing about many of those stories was not the stories themselves. The side articles were there, facts and all, but what made them memorable were the stories of Betty and Lucile out to get this story. Like the article concerning the historic Philibert Cemetery, about to be covered by the waters of Table Rock Lake. The resulting feature in that Sunday's newspaper was far less about the French fur trader, Joseph Philibert, than it was about the James River Bridge that had been washed out, forcing the two women to walk across the river if they wanted to get to the cemetery. And then being saved once they started back by a couple of boaters who rescued them. And Betty's photos of Lucile deep in the James. How could you not enjoy reading Lucile's first-person account of all that? Or the winter that the city desk sent them down to cover the last trip of the Missouri Pacific train line down through Arkansas, Lucile reported, oops, there it is. Lucile reported that there was ice all over everything, and Betty, who was always driving, got upset and she said, "What do they think they're doing, sending us out on a day like this?" Well, in the end, they met up with the train, and when the train got down past Branson, there were tunnels with long, sparkling icicles across the openings. "It's the prettiest thing I ever saw," Lucile wrote. Betty wanted to take the pictures, so they went slow and they let her out, and then she shot a picture of the train coming through a tunnel with the icicles hanging across it. Lucile thought the railroad personnel were wonderfully cooperative. Betty's and her colleagues at the newspaper, on the other hand, were aghast, but probably not surprised. The way they saw it was, Betty actually got the engineer to stop the train so she could take her pictures. Lucile also told me that another time they hollered across the newsroom to Betty and Lucile and said, "A boy has killed his father, go out there." It was on old Highway 65. Betty was driving again, and she said, "We don't even know where we're going," according to Lucile. And then as we rounded the curve, she said, "Oh, there it is. I see the body in the front yard." Well, the father and the boy lived together in that little frame house, and it turned out that it was the son that had been killed. The father got his paycheck and went out and got drunk, and then came home and he started shooting and he killed the boy. And there were many other times when the two women played center stage, when the story's subjects played only supporting roles. But the facts were always there. And the newspaper reading public loved those stories, and they loved those two fearless female journalists. Now, the lesson out of all that for me, and probably the main lesson for Meredith as well, was the advice that Lucile gave young women and girls after she retired and was giving talks. Actually, it was the same advice that she gave when she was a lovelorn columnist in Denver. She told younger women that they could do anything that they wanted to, provided they were interested and capable. And then it was only up to them and how hard they wanted to work. And I guess, in the vernacular of 2024, that translates into Nike's "just do it." Lucile certainly just did it. And when you add in Betty, who always just did it, and you saw the two of them out there covering stories and making friends, how could a reader or a listener not take that advice to heart? And I thank you. I don't know if this group has any questions for me. You probably know more than I do about Lucile, but I'd love to answer all your stories.
Is there any evidence that she would have known in Denver in the 20s Margaret Tobin Brown, otherwise known as the unsinkable Molly Brown?
I don't think so,
who was leading the women's rights, and she was into all kinds of charity events throughout Denver.
Right. Lucile was not there very long, just a little over a year, and she was affiliated with the Denver Women's Press Club, which was quite a big organization. And I wrote to them, and they didn't have any record of her membership, so I don't know if she ever made it to a full member. But if she'd known Molly Brown, I guarantee she would have told us. I mean, that's not something that a person who's used to telling and sharing information would keep secrets. So,
Since the book has been out, and has anyone come out of the woodwork with stories or
no,
things that you didn't know before?
I keep hoping, but no. The closest to that, and I think you three may know this story, but her husband, Lucile's husband, was with Bolivar. And I was trying to find out more about him. He had a bunch of brothers, and his mother had been the daughter of a lieutenant governor, and his father was big in the Republican Party. And I called up to the Historical Society of the library, or somebody up there, and I said, "Is there anybody I could talk to, or do you have any information about Eugene Upton?" And I was writing a book about Lucile. I didn't hear, and I forgot about it. And then one night, it must have been wintertime because it was dark and I was fixing dinner, and the phone rang, and this voice said, "Lucile Upton is a fine, upstanding woman." It was a distant cousin of her husband's, and he was very worried that I was going to say something negative about Lucile. We had a good discussion, And this week I got invited to talk in Oliver, so I guess I get to meet this man, I don't know. But that's the closest to somebody coming out of the woodwork. Lynn?
Ian,
Oh, okay.
because I've got three.
Okay, so I wanted to know how long did it take you to research and write it?
Well, I started I guess when I was 26, talking to her. And then after she died, I came back in 1995 and interviewed a bunch of people. And then when we moved back up here, from the beginning, I came back, I interviewed Mike again, and Dale Freeman again, and Bob Linder, and that was kind of about Betty Amosile. And just started working, and she was my great aunt. And she had given all of her papers to the State Historical Society, and they microfilmed everything and then gave it back. And I, of course, had the stuff that was my mother's, but then as I canvassed the other relatives to learn more, people would say, oh, I've got more of her papers downstairs, come and get them. So I ended up with a room full of, and she wrote everything down. Her speeches, she had little notebooks full of the speeches that she gave, her letters to her best friend, Osha Carroll, who was another reporter who ended up in San Francisco. And like I said, she kept High Garland's letters, and a lot of her articles, tons of stuff. And you know, that was great, especially during COVID, because I couldn't get to any place to look up anything else much. And then I turned it all over to the Library Center, because they have a growing collection of newspaper memorabilia and records and stuff. So that's where I think it belongs. And there may be more. I mean, I have cousins that have papers, and you know, they may turn up again. That was a long time coming. And I wrote it during COVID. Lynn?
I kind of lost track of the timeline there. When did she begin her first job as a reporter? Roughly
In 1923.
23.
Yeah, it was 100 years for the book to come out, so I thought that was kind of cool.
So that'd be just 3 years after the voting, or
Yeah.
constitutional amendment. So yeah, it's a strange thing to think of someone in a professional position just at the cusp of the time that you can vote, but you can do this, that, or the other. The other thing, another thing I was thinking about, correspondence is a lost art now, and probably you said that she replied to every inquiry. It would make a wonderful book if there were probably few and far between now. It's 2024, but if you could put out a call to anybody who received correspondence from her and pull all of that together
What would that be?
and correspondence volume.
Yeah.
And actually, the third question is sort of for Mike. You crossed paths with her then somewhat early in your career.
Yeah, Susan mentioned that when she first met Lucile, Susan was very young, and she thought Lucile was kind of scary. Well, I was newly minted Sunday editor at the News-Leader, and I was in my mid-20s, and I thought she was pretty scary, because she would come in once a week with her typewritten and copying for the Hero days, and occasionally she would not only hand in the coming Sunday's column, but she would make mention of the fact that I had deleted a sentence or two out of the previous Sunday's column in order to make it fit in the allotted frame. And of course, in her estimation, whatever sentence I had deleted was the most important sentence in the entire column. And but later, she decided I was okay, and I decided she wasn't scary. And she was very helpful to me when, in the late 70s, early 80s, I wrote out columns about the Ozarks. And she steered me in some interesting direction. She was very helpful to me. I would visit her in her little rock house there on Himber. And initially she frightened me too.
I thought she liked the boys better. No, I guess not. Anybody else? I'll just finish up with something that last week I was just thinking about this talk, and a woman I know a little bit has written a book called Speaking While Female. And it's a collection of speeches by women. Later ones are actually the whole speeches, but she said, you know, the newspapers would cover men's speeches. And they, if you're lucky, they would mention that a woman had made a talk, but there were women making speeches back from the, colonial times. And so there's this collection of stuff, and I thought, I'll see what hits in the time frame, especially when Lucile started work. And I found a 1914 speech by an attorney who had given some big talk in New York. And she was really, really pleased at how much progress women were making. She said, you know, since 1900, women have had an opportunity. They don't have to be domestics or work in factories or be nurses. And I don't think she mentioned teachers. I think those were the three. And she said, but now there's women in lots of fields. There's journalists and there's attorneys and this and that. And she said, it just makes me really happy. The only thing that excites me more than that is going to the circus. And then she said, look at the women in the circus. Look at what they do. I thought that was just awesome.
Well, we could go across the street.
Yeah, that's right. Talk to the tightrope walkers. Okay, everybody.
I think the one thing we haven't mentioned is that she does have copies of the book for sale. I heard $20.
$20.
$20. So if you need a copy, want an extra copy, donate a copy to a library of your choice.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks.
We're all very loyal to you.